Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the history of India from 1750s to 1857, today we will talk about colonialism and forest. As all of us are aware that how the colonial rule in India during this particular period saw a lot of destruction of the forests and the wildlife, and the impact of such kind of a destruction could be seen in the later times during the post-colonial period as well. And the debate is also in the context of the idea of development and environment, and especially when we see the colonial rule, when we see that British how they came as traders to India and later they settled in India, and how they tried to use all the resources which were available in India rather in such a manner that their interests were primarily commercial in nature. So, when we see the colonial forest policy, we find that colonial forest policy was largely commercial in nature, and how the different sections of the society, those who were dependent on the forests, they were being in a way treated very badly by the British. And in this context, we see that how the industries which were being initiated, the way industrial revolution which took place in Britain, and the industries which developed in Britain, they needed a lot of raw materials, and these raw materials they were being supplied from India and the other colonies. So, in that context, when we see that how colonialism tried to treat the forest areas, how it treated the wildlife, that how so many animals they were being killed in the hunting expeditions which were being carried out by the British, and as well as some of the Indian Maharajas, those who were also in a way influenced by the British. So, idea of conservation, the idea of development that has been discussed by a number of historians when they have tried to analyze the policy which was followed by the British. If you want to see certain readings, then you can see Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha, This Fissured Land, An Ecological History of India, Richard Grove, Green Imperialism, Colonial Expansion, Tropical Island, Edens and the Origins of Environmentalism 1600 to 1800, Anand Bandyopadhyay's article, The Colonial Legacy of Forest Policies in India. So, these are some of the readings which you can refer while one is talking about the colonial forest policy. The debate in the context of the colonial forest policy is that scholars like Ramchandra Guha, they have criticized the way British they functioned in India, the way they used the resources in India, how the people, those who had the customary rights over the forest areas, they were being denied these customary rights, and British they wanted to appropriate as much as resources for themselves. On the other hand, there are other scholars, those who have tried to give another viewpoint where they have tried to defend the colonial forest policy in some way, and they have tried to suggest that the intention of the British was not to utilize the resources the way they were being utilized, and they were the actual people, those who tried to create a situation in India where such kind of consciousness was created with regard to the forest. So, this kind of a debate is there definitely, and when we talk about the idea of the British when they entered India and the way they tried to utilize the resources which were available in India, then we find that how these kind of resources they were being used for the British industries, and the commercial interests of the British they were at the center stage. So, colonialism we find that it was some sort of a turning point in the Indian history, and we find that the colonial forest policy was also some kind of a watershed in the Indian history. And when we see that the people, those who were dependent on the forest, the way they were trying to use the resources which were available for themselves, and they were in a way using those resources for their sustenance or subsistence things, subsistence pattern, and how they were in a way utilized by the British, and their interests they were being marginalized in that way. And we find that the idea of industrialization, the idea of colonialism, they were working in tandem, and both of these things we find during this period, that how the industrial needs of the British they were trying to force India to send those resources to Britain, and how in a way they tried to understand the environment in the context of the kind of situation which was there in India, and how India, which was being seen as a colony, which was being used as a colony, it was providing the kind of resources for the mother country. So we find that the kind of natural resources of India, which were needed to be elevated to the level of commercial use in place of the prevalent general practice of use for subsistence purposes. So this is how the English understanding of the environmental condition in India was, and how the British, they were trying that any kind of restraints which were there in that context, they should be removed. And when we tend to understand that how environment was a central or important aspect in the process, where the resources, they had to be conserved for the future use, and we find that how this kind of a conflict in the ways of life or the kind of cultures, it was also definitely deemed inevitable in this kind of a process. So this kind of conflict which came in the ways of life or in the cultures, it was inevitable in this context, that how British they were trying to reduce, or they were trying to create such kind of a situation for the people, those who were living on the margins, those who were considered to be marginalized, and how the people like tribals which were dependent on the forest or the forest use, they were being chucked out, they were being thrown out from their regions, and the British did not want that the way they were using the resources of the forest, they could be used by them in the long run, because they wanted to appropriate all the resources of the forest for themselves. They also engaged in deforestation during this period, and we see that different kind of phases in the British period with regard to the forest policy, as you can see on the screen as well, that there are three kinds of phases of the colonial forest policy which are there on the screen, and we will concern ourselves largely with the 1796 to 1850 period, which is the period of our study, and we will talk something about the 1850s to 1880s as well, and thereafter you have the 1894 to 1947. So broadly, from the colonial point of view, these three broad phases could be seen, and at the same time we see that the post-colonial forest policy was also in a way it was also a resultant of the kind of a policy which was followed during the colonial period, and the kind of destruction, deforestation which was caused during the colonial period to the Indian resources, especially the forest areas, or to the wildlife as well, we will find that it created a lot of impact in the long run. And when we tend to understand that how British, they needed a lot of raw material for their commercial purposes, and how the forests, they were being used for their personal aims in the context of the commercial policy which they were following. So in that context, the agenda of the colonial power was there to see for everyone, and scholars, they have tried, or they have presented those kind of arguments, that how British, they wanted to increase the revenue collection, and when they wanted to increase the revenue collection, so their agenda was in a way to increase more and more revenue for themselves. And if the land revenue was providing these kind of resources, then the kind of economic policy which they followed, then land revenue was the main source of income for them. And the other activities, they also provided a lot of support to the British commercial interests, and forests were one important source which they could utilize in the long run, and as they did as well. So we find that how the usage of the forests by the British, that was being done, and they wanted that how agricultural expansion should take place, and for deforestation, when they will have deforestation, then more land area will be available for the cultivation of various kinds of crop. So we find that how the forest dwellers they became one of the biggest sufferers in the policy which was being followed by the British. And as I told you earlier, that how how the colonial period is generally seen in the framework that it was an ecological watershed, because it brought those kind of changes in the society which was not there earlier. And how the colonial rule was in a way working hand in glove with the aggressive values of the industrial capitalism, and it did a lot of damage to the native forests. So we find that the colonial rule and the aggressive values of industrial capitalism, they were not much different, and how colonial rule in India, East India Company, and later even the Crown rule, both of them, they were responsible for the kind of destruction or damage which was caused to the forest and to the wildlife as well. So these kinds of issues they are being discussed by the historians like Ramchandra Guha, Madhav Gadgil, those who have tried to see that how the colonial rule was the ecological watershed. And there are others, those who try to reject these kind of ideas. But when we tend to understand the colonial rule in the context of the forest policy, then we will find that they were directly responsible for the decimation of the forest, and if they were not directly responsible, then they created such kind of conditions where we find that the decimation of the forest takes place. And we also find that how the East India Company, how the viceroys, they were representing the interests of the colonial forces, and at the same time the way the forest they were being in a way exploited by this new kind of an agency which was the colonial rule, and they were not at all concerned with the development of the Indian subcontinent at all. And India was in a way systematically converted into some sort of a colony which was serving the interest of the mother country. So we find that British, they remained some sort of a perpetual outsiders in that context. They did not want to develop India in any way. They did not want to utilize the kind of money which they had generated in India for the development of India in any way. Rather, they wanted to take all that money to Britain and use that money for themselves. So we find that when we tend to understand the colonial forest policy and the way the colonial forest policy functioned, then we will find that British, those who came initially as traders, the way they developed the transport and the communication network, especially the way railways etc. they were being developed, the telegraph they were being developed, and how railways they were being used by the British to serve their own interest, because the way railway lines they were being designed, these railway lines were going to the interior areas of India, and from these interior areas resources they were being collected, and then these resources they were being brought to the port towns, and then they were being exported to Britain. So that was the kind of network, that was the kind of situation in which the colonial forest policy was functioning, and how the colonial political economy also gained because of these kind of policies which were followed by the British. And British in a way they tried to see that their administration was working in that framework where this kind of a policy which was the commercial forestry or commercial forest policy which was initiated by them. So it was a kind of a larger network when we try to understand this kind of a policy, where you will find that British they were in a way trying to use their own resources which they generated in India in the framework of some sort of an imperial policy, and the way they were trying to generate more and more revenue for themselves, so that they were able to self support themselves in India. As you can see on the screen as well, that how these kind of forest products they had to be marketed, and when these forest products they were being taken to Britain, and then they were in a way designed in such a way that they could be sent to the markets. So in a way, colonial rule was making some kind of continuous efforts to find more and more markets for themselves, and the multiple species of the Indian tropical forests, the way they were being exploited by the colonial masters or the colonial rulers, that has also to be seen. So the focus of the British in the forest policy context, as they were the imperial rulers, and at the same time they considered themselves to be the undisputed masters, and they also propagated the kind of ideas in the framework that the idea of white man's burden, where they felt that the natives, they had to be civilized by them. The natives were in a way savage, and these savage people, when they will get the light of education of Christianity, when they will be converted to Christianity, when they will be in a way become more they will be able to reconcile to the fact that British were superior to them, when they will be converted into such citizens where they taste their opinions, their morality and their intellect, as Thomas Babington Macaulay talked about, that they remain only Indians in blood and color, but they try to adapt the Indians, they will try to adapt themselves to the colonial rule. So this or the colonial taste and preferences. So we find that this kind of an imperial policy, where they tried to present themselves in such a way, could be seen in the ideological framework as well. And we see that how Ramchandra Guha, he talks about, as you can see on the screen as well, that he says that how the British, they established an autocratic forest department which sought to exploit the timber for the imperial needs by enclosing the forest and excluding peasantry from using them as a resource base. So this is what Ramchandra Guha, he argues, and he has argued in this framework when he tries to see that how British, they were trying to exploit both the peasantry as well as the tribals, and how they were trying to appropriate more and more resources for themselves. And we find that Guha was highly critical of the colonial rule, and he sees that how British, they were trying to exploit Indians in every manner, and the colonial forest policy was one such example. And on the other hand, scholars like Richard Grove, those who have given a separate or a different kind of an argument in which they are trying to negate the kind of argument which has been given by Ramchandra Guha, and they see that the British, they were the original Greens, and they brought such kind of a policy where you will find that benefits to the forests they occur. And we also find that if you tend to compare the different times, and then we find that the period which was considered to be pre-colonial was seen to be a period which was harmonious, and where you will find that the sustainable resource management is taking place. So from that framework, we see that colonialism is seen as some sort of a breaking point, and the intervention of the colonial state and the attendant revenue and the proprietary rights regime, it played havoc with the common resources, leading to the demise of village traditions of sustainable resource use. So this kind of a change from the pre-colonial times to the colonial times could be seen, where the kind of picture which we had of the pre-colonial times is a picture which is a happy kind of a picture, which is a more harmonious kind of a picture. And on the other hand, colonialism basically is the kind of is some sort of a breaking point, which is showing that how the kind of intervention which has been made by the colonial state, not only in the land revenue, where we find that different kind of revenue settlements, they were being introduced, that how the common masses or the peasants, they suffered because of the land revenue systems which were initiated by the British. We find that how the deindustrialization occurred because of the policies which were followed by the British. The commercialization of agriculture again in a way hampered the fertility of the soil, and the peasants they lost in the long run, how the various famines which occurred during the 19th century were as a result of the policies which were followed by the British, how the peasant and the tribal revolt during this time were also because of the kind of policies which were followed by the British. So we find that British, they in a way were trying to bring that kind of a change in the society, where the common properties of the areas, they became the kind of a state property, and the customary rights which were with the masses at that point of time, they were being taken away by them, and the kind of free access resources which were with the community earlier, these kind of resources were taken by the British for themselves. So we find that the kind of role which was being played by the British, that is seen to be some kind of a villainous role, and there are others, those who reject this kind of a view that British, they played that kind of a villainous role, and they argue that the colonial power, it initiated some kind of a systematic forest conservation policy in the colonies. So these are the kind of debates with regard to that, and the idea of the development and the conservation, it also goes together. One has to understand both these kinds of ideas which are there, and at the same time we have to also see the colonial forest policy in the context that how this colonial forest policy in a way impacted the post-colonial forest policy as well. The rest we will discuss in our next talk or in the next session. Thank you very much.